We just got to the point with the last several topics where we understand how the keyword this is handled. Now we will take a look at arrow functions, which handles it differently. I have mixed feelings about this difference with arrow functions. I think it complicates something that was already very complicated, specifically understanding the keyword this in JavaScript. But arrow functions are everywhere, so if an arrow function includes the keyword this, you need to understand how it is resolved. In the next topic, I'll discuss situations where you shouldn't use an arrow function in regards to the keyword this. Now, I mentioned in the previous topic that arrow functions use lexical binding for the keyword this. Well, what does that mean? So we talked about the term lexical earlier in the course. Remember, it refers to words, and so lexically is where the code sits. The lexical environment is what the code is a part of, where it is placed in relation to other things. Remember, the lexical environment establishes the scope of variables and functions. Well, with arrow functions, the lexical environment, where that arrow function is placed, determines the object referenced by the keyword this. It is not how the function is invoked that determines a reference object, as we learned for traditional functions. So you have to take a different approach thinking about arrow functions than you did with traditional functions. Let's look at a few situations where this change in arrow functions helps us and makes sense. And this will also illustrate how we resolve the keyword this with arrow functions. Now, this code should be looking familiar to you. We've dealt with this a few times now where we've declared an object and we have a name property and then there's a method inside that object. And when that method is called, it logs to the console the keyword this, but it also sets up another function expression and invokes that. And that function expression logs to the console. So just to remind us what gets displayed there, let me go ahead and open the console. And let me bring back the code first before I talk about it. The first console log statement, the keyword this represents this object. But remember, the second console log statement represents window. Because the first console log statement, the function is invoked with object, and so that is assigned the keyword this. That's the object the keyword this references. But that's not the case with the second one. We just invoke it. And so it's set to window. Now, as you remember, if we had use strict up here, then it would be undefined. Now, let's see what happens if we change this function in here to an arrow function. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to remove the function keyword. And I'm going to place a fat arrow here. We'll just keep the curly braces in. That's fine. But now we have an arrow function. Now when we save this, notice what happens. It's that object. It's the object. It's the same as this. And that's what we would hope would happen. If we use the keyword this inside a function that is inside an object, we would hope it refers to that object. And it does with an arrow function, because the value or the object that is referenced with the keyword this in an arrow function is based lexically. Where is that function placed? Well, that function is placed inside this object. Okay. Now, remember back earlier in the course, we talked a lot about execution context. And when JavaScript runs, it establishes an execution context. Or when a function runs, it establishes an execution context. And a part of that is the object that the keyword this references. That's part of what is established. So when an arrow function runs, it looks for the value of the keyword this. It isn't based upon how it's invoked. It looks for that value. And the first place this function looks is inside its outer environment. And we know that that outer environment, the object, is this one that is referenced. And so that's why this gets set to that object using arrow function. So this is a situation where an arrow function is helpful. If we want to use this to refer to the object of a function that's embedded, then we can use an arrow function to do that. All right, let's look at another situation. This one's going to be a bit more common. Let's say we wanted to set up an object. I'm going to call it controller. And this object is going to be used to contain a lot of the code for a small application we're doing. We don't want to pollute the global environment. We don't want to add a lot of stuff to window. And so we set up this object so everything's contained within the object. And this is the only part that's on the global environment. And so I have some properties here. This is simply data. That's what we'll put there. I also have an init function like this. And this init function is going to run in order to set things up. And all we're going to do is we're going to set up a variable title, and then we're going to grab from the document this right here, this div has an ID of title 2. We've used it before. So I'm going to use get element by ID, and then title 2 is what I want to grab. So now we have that DOM element. Now we can add an event listener to it. And we want to have the event click. So when it's clicked on, we're going to do something. And here's where I'll put in a function. I'm just doing a regular function right now. And we're going to console log this.data. Okay. So the thought is we're going to display this information that's a part of this object. That's the initial thought. But as you are undoubtedly aware, because of what we've gone through with the keyword this already, this is not going to work for us. It's not going to work. But let's go ahead and take a look at it. So I'm going to invoke controller.init to kick things off here. And let me just save that and let's see what happens. Now, if I go out here and I click on this div here, we get undefined. So what happens is this references the window object, and there is no data attribute on the window object, so we get undefined. Now, we looked at ways to solve this previously. We could use bind, for example. But what would happen if we used an arrow function? That's what I'm going to do now. So I'm just going to turn this into arrow function. This will be the fat arrow portion here. We're just going to log to the console, this.data, same thing still, but now we're using an arrow function inside of that. All right, I think I've got everything set up correctly. So if I save that and then come out here and click on that, now we get the data. Once again, an arrow function. So the keyword this is going to be set based upon its context. It's inside of this object. And so that's what the keyword this is set to. So this type of situation we're looking at here is a situation where an arrow function is very helpful. But there are also multiple places we should not use an arrow function if we're using the keyword this. And we're going to take a look at those next. So let's move on.